And the purpose of this talk is basically to tell you guys about what I believe is a really good way to direct your career and ideally even your life toward doing more good in the world. Big topic, but we'll get more into the details as we get there. Before I start, I just want to ask folks, how many people have heard of effective altruism before? Okay, so it looks like about half maybe? How many people feel like they could explain what effective altruism is? Okay, so like a few people, and they're all in the front row. All right, not surprising. Cool, so I'm going to tell you guys about this movement called effective altruism. So effective altruism, this is not working.
There you go.
And it's still not working.
Sorry.
There we go, now it's working. Okay. So effective altruism is a movement that, still not working. Okay. Do you want to play around with this until you get it working?
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Now
Yeah,
works.
sorry.
Okay, now
Working on
we're all
the
good.
screen, everything.
Pretend that never happened. So effective altruism is a movement that developed about a decade ago out of Oxford and Cambridge. And the core idea behind this movement is actually a very simple one, right? The basic idea is that most people who are good people like yourselves, obviously, want to do good things in the world. They want to be helpful, they want to be charitable, they want to improve the circumstances of lives of people who are less fortunate than them. And when you look at all the things we do as human race, things like science and engineering and politics, we have advanced so far in the way that we do these things, in that we leverage our knowledge of science and statistics and psychology and all these things to be as rigorous as possible in how to produce the optimal world for human beings, right? But for some reason, when we think about charity, when we think about doing good, we tend to turn our brains off. We tend to just think, oh yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like a very noble, wonderful thing to do. And we don't apply the tools of reason and analysis and science to what is presumably the most important thing that we do as a human race. So effective altruism is this idea, and this is still not working. Let me,
Sorry.
here, do you want to play around with this until this works? So effective altruism is a movement that's not just about doing good, it's about doing the most good. And what I mean by that is that instead of just saying, yeah, that thing sounds like it works, that thing sounds like it's good for people, the real question is, why shouldn't we try as rigorously as possible to find the best thing and to have the most impact per person, per hour, per dollar? It means taking a scientific approach to an area where people usually don't levy the tools of science and the tools of statistical rigor. And it means not just thinking about these things, but also figuring out how to implement them into your life. Whether it be through the places you give for charity, whether it be where you spend your time volunteering, or whether it just be how you architect the arc of your career. All of these things matter in how much impact you have on the world. Okay? So, to give you a better sense of effective altruism, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first story is about a program called Scared Straight. How many people have heard of Scared Straight? Okay, most people. So Scared Straight, for those of you who don't know, this was a really big social program in the US in the 80s and 90s was kind of its heyday. They used to have commercials, it was like a well-known thing that was going on, where basically what they would do is they would take at-risk youths who live in sort of rough and tumble cities or who are in places where they have high crime rates, and they would take them on sort of field trips to prisons. And they'd go parade them around the hallways, and the prisoners would say, oh, it's so terrible to be in prison, don't go to prison, right? And the idea, of course, is that they would be scared straight. That they'd be so terrified they would see viscerally how bad it was to be in prison, and they wouldn't do bad things and end up in prison. So this was the idea. It was widely lauded as one of the most important social programs to try to combat the crime wave that was going on in the US in the 80s and 90s. This is like some AMC show or something that came out relatively recently. So average juveniles, 2 decades, whatever, very important, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there's only one problem with Scared Straight, which is that it didn't work. Now, what do I mean by that it didn't work? So what I mean is not that it basically didn't really have an important impact in stopping the crime wave. In reality, the crime wave did stop, right? Crime has gotten much lower in the US since the turn of the century. But the reality is that when you actually ran the studies, which didn't happen until 2 decades later, when people actually ran the meta-analyses, what they found was that Scared Straight increased recidivism rates by 13%, meaning that Scared Straight caused more crime rather than caused less. Okay? That's really weird. And it's really weird also that nobody cared to look And then they just assume, they're like, well, this has this nice impression of being a wonderful thing to combat crime, therefore let's throw a bunch of money at it. And so what's the moral here? The moral is that this thing still doesn't work. Oh my goodness, okay.
Sorry.
Let's go back, okay, cool. The moral is that doing good is harder than you think, right? And the reality is that most things don't work. Now this is kind of unsurprising in almost every other domain, right? If you're trying to start a business to make money, your first assumption is going to be, well, my first idea probably won't work, right? If you're going to try to run a scientific experiment, you assume the null hypothesis. Probably my intervention does nothing, right? But for some reason, when it comes to charity, we assume that things just work. We assume that things have the impact we imagine them to have, and we don't intuitively think, well, almost everything doesn't work, therefore we should go run the studies and actually figure out rigorously what works and how much impact does it have. Instead, we give everything the benefit of the doubt, which is the exact opposite attitude that we should have in domains that matter a lot. That's really weird. Okay, next example, education in East Africa. So East Africa has very, very low literacy and education rates. And of course, it's very poor, high rates of disease, a lot of agricultural societies. And so in order to get kids to go to school and sort of, kind of raise the floor of just, literacy and sophistication and infrastructure, you need kids to go to school. Now it's tough for kids to go to school. One, because, they're sort of, there tend to be a lot of other competing demands for their time, such as, one, things like illness, two, their families being very poor, three, having to work as a child. And so there was a group of researchers at MIT in the Poverty Action Lab who wanted to study, this guy is not being helpful, there we go. So they were trying to study what is the most effective way to try to get more students to go to school in East Africa, okay? And so they had 3 interventions that they tried. Right? I want to explain to you what these 3 interventions were, and they sort of ran the experiments. The first intervention was they decided to give the students free school uniforms, right? Because it's sort of post-colonial Africa, so everybody has to wear school uniforms. That can be a pain, so let's just hand them out. The second intervention they tried was conditional cash transfers for girls. Okay, so this basically says, if you go to school, we'll pay your parents or your family some money, and that's like a direct incentive for you to go to school. So let's not be cute about it, let's just pay them. And the third idea was merit-based scholarship. So if the girls in the schools worked hard, they would get a scholarship. Okay, now I want to take a vote. And I want you guys to predict which of these interventions was most successful. Okay, so take a look at the 3. How many people think that merit scholarships were the most effective intervention? Okay, a couple people. You voted. Why do you think merit scholarships would be the most effective?
I don't know, just hoping that if you're pouring in some effort, then you're going to retain information rather than if you're just getting direct cash, you're not invested in your learning.
Right, so it incentivizes you to work hard as opposed to just show up.
Yeah,
that's a good reason. Who thinks conditional cash transfers for girls was most effective? All right, so about half everybody left. Why do you think that?
I think what was the purpose was just to get people to show up to school, then this most likely would have been the most effective to get them there in the first place. That's what I think.
Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. No, it's directly incentivize the behavior you want. That's the simplest path to getting people in school. Fair enough. How many people think free school uniforms was the most effective? Okay. Yeah, why do you think that?
I think that probably most people, most kids didn't need to have an incentive to go to school, that having free school uniforms removes an obstacle that might prevent them
Right.
from going to school.
Yeah, that's a great argument. Now, notice how good all those arguments were, right? They were all very plausible reasons why, if these were 3 separate charities, why, conditional cash transfer makes sense, just incentivize the behavior you want. Oh, this is great because it incentivizes people to actually work hard and not show up. This is great because it just removes barriers to showing up to school, right? The point is, you can't really know without actually running the fucking experiment, right? So they did that. And if this thing will go right, then we can learn what that is. And here's what happened, okay? So turns out free uniforms blasted the other 2 interventions out of the water, okay? And of course, there's no way in hell that you would know that without actually running the experiment. And it turns out the delta between free uniforms and conditional cash transfers was basically like 7x. So it was a really big difference in impact between the most effective intervention and the least effective one, okay? But they actually tested one more thing. And the last thing they tested was just telling parents how much money their children would make if they went to school. And it turned out this was way more effective than anything else per dollar intervention. And in fact, the researchers didn't even think that this was a good idea to try because numeracy rates in Africa are so low that they assumed their parents wouldn't understand the charts that they were showing them about how much money their children would make. But it turns out this one intervention is so much more effective than anything else, you can't even see this on the chart. Okay? It's literally multiple orders of magnitude more effective than any of the other interventions. Okay? So, what's the point of this experiment? The point of this story is that there's a huge gap between a good charity and a great one, and an even bigger gap between a bad charity and a good one. Right? So, again, most things don't work. And the delta between interventions is huge. Okay? Now, if you just sort of look kind of, if you sort of smear your gaze over like, well, this charity sounds really wonderful, this one also sounds wonderful, this one sounds so delightful, you're going to paper over those differences. You're not really going to understand that on the ground, for the real thing you care about, which is ultimately impacting people's lives, the differences really matter. Okay, next story. Yeah, well, I'll take questions at the end, by the way. Back in 2007, there were these two guys, Holden and Ellie, who worked at a hedge fund in New York. And they're kind of guys who were very philanthropic. They wanted to donate some money, and they were trying to find a good way to figure out where are the best charities to donate to on a pound for pound basis. Right? How can I get the most benefit for any dollar that I send? All right, that's what that means. So now at the time, they sort of try to see what was out there in terms of charity research to find what are the most effective charities. And they had a really hard time finding anything. And in fact, the only site that really tried to do the sort of charity evaluation was a site known as Charity Navigator. How many people are familiar with Charity Navigator? A few people. Okay, so just to give you an idea, Charity Navigator is this website. It's like one of the most popular websites for evaluating charities. And basically what it does, you look up a 501(c) charity, and essentially you'll see like a pie chart that shows you the breakdown of where they spend their money, right? So it's like, okay, 10% on marketing, 5% fundraising, 25% salaries, and then the rest on fulfillment, right? And so naturally, what people think when they look at this site is like, okay, I want as little as possible on salary, as little as possible, I want the most going towards the direct program, okay? Now, Ellie and Holden looked at this, and they were like, what the hell is this? This is worthless, right? Why is this worthless? The reason why it's worthless is, can you go back? Go back a couple slides. There we go. Yeah. The reason why it's worthless is this slide right here. Right. The reason why it's worthless is that if I showed you a pie chart of how each of these four charities spent their money on marketing versus paying employees versus whatever, it would have absolutely nothing to tell you about what was the best charity to donate to. Right. It's a complete non sequitur. It's like if I tell you a company is spending 20% of its budget on marketing, does that tell you you should invest in the company or not? Of course not, right? The only thing that you really care about for a company is, does it maximize profit? And whether it decides that the best way to do that is by hiring a bunch of people, or the best way to do that is by spending a bunch on marketing, great, go do that, right? For a charity, the thing that actually matters is impact. That's the thing that you really care about. How much impact does this charity provide for a given dollar of input? But just looking at a pie chart doesn't tell you anything, right? So, a couple slides forward. So Ellie and Holden looked at that and they thought, well, this is screwed up. Somebody needs to go fix this. And so they decided they were going to go fix it. So they started an organization called GiveWell. And what GiveWell does is it basically aggregates data from all sorts of nonprofits all around the world and tries to take the best data that they have, ideally randomized controlled trials, and essentially does sort of open analysis on them. And tells folks who are potential charity donators what they believe, based on the available data, are the most effective interventions anywhere in the world. And every year, they publish their results and a ranking of what they believe are the most effective charities in the world. Now, the reality is, most charities don't give their data to GiveWell. Why do you think that is? I mean, the answer is that most data is not flattering, right? Most data shows that, like we said, most things don't work, right? Which is not surprising. We should expect that most things don't work. If we're being scientific and rigorous, we're like, of course most things are not going to work. That's cool, that's okay. It allows us to more efficiently allocate resources if we know what's working and what doesn't. But GiveWell has basically become a kind of de facto charity evaluator. for many, many people around the world, and especially here in Silicon Valley where they're based at. So in 2007, GiveWell moved just $300K to their top charities the first year that they were in business. And this last year they moved over $65 million. And they now advise multiple foundations that manage billions of dollars from wealthy donors who've decided that they want to also adopt the approach of effective altruism. Okay, so now let's zoom out a little bit. Let's talk about how do you decide where to donate to. Let's say you say, okay, fine, science, whatever, that's cool, I like it. But how do you actually decide where to donate to? Okay, so the first thing is that you got to decide your cause area. Where, generally, what kind of problem are you going to try to solve? Okay, and there are a few principles that effective altruists use to decide what makes for a good cause area. Okay, so the first thing, okay, fine. Okay, the first thing is how important is that cause area? Okay, and by this I mean just literally what's the magnitude of this problem? Okay, so let's say for example you are looking at, let's say you wanted to box yourself into health, and you wanted to solve you wanted to cure some kind of disease. Okay, so you could choose a disease like Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease afflicts a lot of people. It's a really terrible illness. It's genetic, and so you might think like, yes, this is terrible. I've seen portrayals of it on House. I want to end this disease once and for all. Okay, so that's awesome. But the downside is that not very many people suffer from Huntington's disease. It's actually a very, very rare disease, right? On the other hand, cancer kills about 25% of all human beings. Okay, cancer is a very terrible disease, and if you could cure cancer, you would save many, many, many more lives than if you cured Huntington's disease, right? So just getting a sense of what is the actual scale of this problem, if I solved it, matters in deciding what's the most effective place to devote my resources. And the second question you want to ask yourself is how crowded is the space? Okay, so going back to the cancer example, so cancer is one of those things that like everybody has some experience with cancer. Everybody knows somebody, or some of you may have even gone through it yourselves. And so it's very obvious that like, cancer's terrible. Many, many people die from it. We should try to cure cancer. Okay? Now here's the problem. The problem is that many other people feel the same way you do. And because they all feel the same way you do, they are very happy funding any kind of cancer research. And so the net result of that is that any cancer researcher who has a half-baked idea about how to actually cure cancer can get funding very easily, because funding is very, very rich in the cancer sector. So what that means is that your marginal dollar, adding one more dollar to all the funding available for cancer research, is unlikely to really move the bar, because of the fact that all the good ideas are already being funded, right? Whereas, take on the other hand, tropical diseases like malaria, right? These tend to afflict people who are not in the first world. They tend to be sort of long-standing diseases that sort of are around for a long time. So not like outbreaks like Ebola or something like that. These diseases tend to kill many, many people around the world, but they don't garner media headlines. They're not as sympathetic to wealthy countries because they tend not to happen in wealthy countries. And so the marginal dollar that goes into studying how to cure tropical diseases is a much less crowded bet than betting on cancer, right? So just asking, what will $1 more or $100 more or $1,000 more do in this space, given how much funding is already there, is an important question to answer when you decide how to donate your money. So the next question is, how tractable is this problem area, right? So one example here is, one really terrible thing in the world is war, right? War is terrible. If we could stop war, that'd be great. However, nobody has any fucking clue how to stop war, right? We don't know a charity we can donate to. There's no foundation that stops war, right? Like, basically, it's kind of up to just the people in power to stop war, right? So, unfortunate as that is, I don't think anybody really has any good idea how to fund a 501(c) that stops war. However, there are things that we actually do know how to make progress towards, right? Such as, minimizing the contraction of malaria. That's a very tractable thing. We actually know how to do that, right? Or like, putting vaccines or iodizing salt. Really straightforward things that we actually totally know how to do are very tractable and just require money, right? These are the kinds of interventions that are much more likely to actually result in positive outcomes than ones that are kind of like, well, this is a big problem, but I don't even know where to start and how to solve it. And then, whoops, go back. No, there, no, okay, there we go. So, here are some of the causes. I'm trying to wrap this up pretty soon because I can see people are getting antsy. So here are just some of the causes that effective altruists effective altruism is a pretty broad movement, so there are a lot of differing opinions and beliefs about what is the most effective way to improve the world. But different people have arrived at different ideas of cause areas. And here are some of the most commonly supported cause areas by effective altruists. So the first and most obvious one is global health and development. Okay? Basically, the idea here is that there are a lot of, what's going on? Check-in. Okay, all right. Good time to take a break. How long does it take for people to do check-ins? 20 seconds? Okay, we'll take a 20-second break. I need some water. Huh. They did not do that back when I was at Academy. Yeah, I guess you just a lot more cats are heard now. All right, we all checked in? Make sure you check in, guys. You don't want to be counted absent. Okay. All right, let's get back. So, global health and development. Basically, the idea here is that there are a lot of people in the world who are still in abject poverty. Right? I don't know if you guys saw this controversy about Bill Gates and the I don't know. Maybe if you guys don't read Vox, maybe show up. But there are a lot of people in the world who are still in fairly dire straits and are very, very poor and do not have good health, sanitation, very, very basic things that you would want as a human being. And the thing is, most of this is outside of the first world. Most of this is outside the United States. And let's say, for example, you wanted to lower the infant mortality rate in the U.S. That is extremely difficult because the infant mortality rate in the U.S. is already very low. And all the low-hanging fruit to improve infant mortality has already been plucked. But this is not true at all in other parts of the world, right? And so for very cheap, you can do very, very basic things like just vaccinating children or deworming them or giving them cleaner water or iodized salt or all these very basic examples of things that you can do to prevent the death of children around the world. So basically the floor is so low in other countries that just by diverting some of your resources toward health and development in different places around the world, that is where you can end up doing the most good just in improving human lives. So that's one cause area that a lot of people donate to. A second cause area is animal suffering. So depending on your ethical framework, if you believe that animals suffer and that they have souls and that, or whatever the analog of souls is in your worldview, that perhaps factory farming is one of the worst things that we do as a human being. And 60 billion farm animals are raised in factory farms every single year. And any intervention that we can do to reduce the suffering in animals ends up, just by the magnitude of the problem, can end up resulting in a huge decrease in the amount of suffering in the world. Right? So folks who are animal activists, the interventions that tend to be successful are oftentimes just lobbying. So one example of this is, so McDonald's is one of the largest purchasers of chicken in the world. And it turned out one of the things that was, one of the charities that's highly supported in the effective altruist community, basically what they did is they lobbied McDonald's to try to get them to stop buying chickens that were in battery cages. Okay, so if you're not familiar with battery cages, they're these very, very small cages that basically chickens, when they grow to full size, they basically cannot move. And so it's very, very painful existence to live inside of a battery cage. And essentially, one day McDonald's just caved. They decided, look, all right, fine, we're not going to buy chickens in battery cages anymore. And the thing is, because McDonald's is such a dominant purchaser in the market for chickens, the entire supply chain of farms just overnight switched to no longer using battery cages. And every other competitor of Whataburger and whatever other places, they also, in wanting to sort of keep up with the Joneses, decided to also stop purchasing battery cage chickens. And so with a fairly small intervention, suddenly a very, very large impact on all the chickens that are grown for US consumption suddenly changed, right? And so even relatively small interventions can have very large impacts in the space just because of the magnitude of the suffering that goes on for animals. So next cause area are existential risks. So these are things that basically, if gone unchecked, could lead to very, very massive negative outcomes, such as a nuclear war is one of the most obvious ones. So this is, a lot of people believe that nuclear war is basically contained, but there's a lot of arguments that, there's so many uncertain international fronts right now between the US and China and the Middle East that just doing anything possible to minimize the chance of nuclear war is extremely important. Because if it does happen, the consequences are so dire. And so there are other things along these lines as a result of accelerating technology. So you might have heard Elon Musk, the late Stephen Hawking, Sam Harris talk about AI risk. And basically the idea that as AI becomes more powerful, and becomes more powerful very quickly and starts becoming responsible for more and more of the world's infrastructure, it might become very dangerous if we don't understand very well how to control this AI and make sure that it's aligned with human interests. Or alternatively, pandemics, bioterrorism, these sorts of things that are becoming more and more possible very rapidly, but we don't have good frameworks on how to control them and how to make sure they don't spiral out of hand or end up in the wrong hands. So this is another cause area where a lot of effective altruists believe that because very little attention gets paid to these topics, they might be abnormally important to devote your own resources or attention towards. And then finally, whoops, one back. The last cause area that people like to look at is policy reform. So the idea here, of course, is that when you think policy, you might think like, oh, okay, so like donating to a presidential election because Donald Trump is terrible, and maybe we want to like make sure he doesn't win in 2020. But this is usually not what is meant by policy, right? And the reason why is that if you remember back to our framework about tractability and crowdedness, presidential elections are some of the most crowded things you could possibly put money into, right? The amount of money that goes into deciding who's going to win the national election is enormous. But there are a lot of other impactful elections that go on all the time, and a lot of other important policy decisions that go on all the time that are much quieter, don't have nearly as many constituents, and end up having a much larger lever for you as a donator to end up having a big impact down the road. So these are things that tend not to electrify the political national debate, like things like prison reform, or things like just changing the way that regulations around technology or housing laws and things like that, they can end up having a large downstream impact, either here or overseas. So, and also this extends to using better cost effectiveness measures within policymaking. So a lot of times, if any of you have worked in government, you know that it is very, very hard to get decision makers to really read and understand and be statistically literate about stuff that goes on a policy scale. But the more that we can do that, the better decisions we ultimately make as a society. So this is another area that a lot of people are focusing on. So, cool. So that's effective altruism in a nutshell. You guys have gotten a sense of it. Now the question is, what about you? How can you get involved? What role can this play in your life? Why am I even talking to you about this? Great question. So the first way, of course, that you can get involved in effective altruism is through your choice of your career. Okay. So there's this website. You're next. There's this website known as 80,000 Hours, and the name of the site comes from the fact that in your career, on average, everybody spends 80,000 hours working over the course of your life. Right? It's a lot of time. And it behooves you to think about how is it that you want to be spending that time throughout the course of your life, and how much impact you want to have through your career itself. Now, I know that you guys are all at App Academy, so technically I can't tell you to choose a different career, but even within the tech industry, there's a big delta between working at a place that is not having a good impact and working at a place that has a lot of impact. And it's quite likely that not all of you will be software engineers for all of your life. 80,000 Hours is a great resource, and it's one that I actually consulted very heavily when I first started down my journey of effective altruism back in 2013 when I first came across these guys. And they had a big impact on me in deciding the way that I wanted to live my life and think about my own life trajectory. So the other way, of course, you can be involved is through donating money. Now, all of you here, I mean, presumably you're all unemployed right now, but you will pretty soon, according to their App Academy statistics, be making a lot of money. Okay, and the further you go on in your career, you'll be making even more money. And so donations might be one of the most effective ways for you guys to actually give back and express your beliefs and desires about the world through, basically putting your money where your mouth is. So, next slide. So now it might feel like, well, the mayor is expensive, and I don't know, like I'm not making that much money relative to the folks who are running these companies and whatnot. So I think it's useful to kind of ground yourself and get a sense of just how hard it is to make the kind of money that you guys are going to be making. Okay, so this right here is the world income distribution. So this is over all countries, all people everywhere in the world, and you can see like 60% of people are at about something like $3,000. Okay, so just making right here, if we just draw this line out, just making about $15,000 puts you in the top 10 percentile in the world. Okay, that is not a lot of money in the U.S., but around the world, that is a shitload of money. Okay, and you can see it quickly drops off, such that making something like 100K. Now you're not a 1%er in the U.S. if you make 100K, but you are a very, very 1%er in the world. if you make 100K. Okay. Next slide. Whoop, oh, back. Oh, forward. There we go. Oh, back. There we go. All right, cool. The U.S. median income is $30,000. That puts you in the top 4% globally. Okay. Now, what does this mean? What is the importance of this? It means that 99% of all people, just randomly born into the world, make way less money than you do. Okay. You are a 1%er in the world. Okay. And the question is, what do you do with that? How do you process that information? What do you do from here now, knowing that you're a 1%er? Next slide. So there's a lot of talk in Silicon Valley, especially lately, about privilege, right, and the different dimensions of privilege. Now, obviously, we know the most basic ones. There's race, there's class, there's gender, and having the privileged version of all of those dimensions makes it easier for you to get forward in life. But we don't ever talk about probably the most significant form of privilege in the world, which is nationality, right? Just by being born into the United States, you are already one of the most privileged people on earth. If you were born into a country that did not have the same economic power, that did not have the same freedoms, that did not have the same social mobility, that did not have the same centrality in the growth of technology, you would not be here. You would not be doing anything nearly like this, right? And so, for myself, I often think of myself in my shittier moments as being like, well, I worked so hard to get to where I am because I didn't go to Harvard, I studied English and learned how to code and then blah, 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 I worked my way up. But the reality is that I was born in the United States. I was born a citizen, right? Most people around the world, not most people, a lot of people around the world, they would pay a lot of money to become US citizens. And they try. Many, many people around the world try their goddamn hardest to get into the US and can't, right? It is a reward that you were born into if you are a citizen here. And, I speak English, which is one of the most important languages on earth. I am literate, I am smart, I was born to a family that didn't have significant economic hardship. And all of that made it possible for me to get to where I am today and make a stupid amount of money in Silicon Valley, in one of the weirdest markets in the history of the world, where random folks who studied just, whatever, liberal arts like me, can go get a job making a bunch of money and become a 1%er, right? That's really weird. It's really weird that we were able to find ourselves in a world where that's possible. And given that we are here, the question is, what responsibility do you have as a beneficiary of that system to give back and to have a big impact beyond just your own life? So there's an organization called Giving What We Can. And Giving What We Can, basically they're a group of folks who pledge on the basis of their own admission that, hey, I've lived a pretty good life, I'm pretty lucky, most people aren't as lucky as I am, so I'm going to give some money to charity every single year. And I'm going to try to give them to the most impactful charities I can. And generally speaking, the threshold that Giving What We Can encourages people to have is 10%. 10% is sort of small enough that it's basically, it's one raise, right? So I'm sort of one raise behind my peers in terms of how much money I'm making, but in terms of my take home. But basically my standard of living is essentially the same. I just take Uber pools instead of X's or something. It's not an onerous amount of donating. So this is a career path or a way to become more involved in effective altruism, or it leads to one known as earning to give. And this is what I chose to do in my life back in 2013 when I first decided I was going to move to Silicon Valley and go to App Academy and do all this stuff. It was because I decided that I wanted to earn to give. So earning to give, it's a very simple idea, and I'll explain it just in ideally a few sentences. So you can imagine that if I want to do the most good in the world, one thing I can think to do is okay, I'm going to go join the Peace Corps, right? And I'm going to go to Tanzania or something, and work in some shelter, and I don't know, I have all these visions of how hard it's going to be. I'm going to get bitten by mosquitoes. I'm going to work so hard. I'm going to take all these great selfies, and it's going to be great, right? Now it turns out if I go get a job on Wall Street or in the tech industry and make a bunch of money, I can probably make enough money and then donate it to pay for someone else to go join the Peace Corps. And that person will probably do just as much good as I am, because it's not like I'm amazing at, whatever, injecting people with needles or whatever the hell they're doing in there. And so, it's not as though that's my advantage is being in the Peace Corps, right? In fact, my advantage is really in the fact that I'm pretty smart and I'm good at technology and I can learn how to be an engineer, right? But if you think about it, if I make enough money and I'm successful enough, I can donate enough to get 2 people to join the Peace Corps, or 3, or 5. And so the idea is that if your comparative advantage is in earning money, then earning to give is actually a way to become more effective than in many ways that you could do directly by working for a nonprofit yourself, right? So this was the idea that I think very convinced me back in 2013 when I first decided to pursue getting into the tech industry, to pursue the path that I have. So I just want to tell you guys a little bit about my story, just so you kind of know what brought me here. So I'm sure some of you probably vaguely know who I am. I gave one of the lectures, but just to give you the very, very short version. So I used to be a professional poker player. I did that for about 5 years, from when I was 16 till I was 21. And around that time, I also went to school and I studied English and philosophy, which are both totally worthless. But at the time, I was like, I don't know, what do I care about money? So I was never very motivated by money when I was a kid. I sort of made enough of it at a young age that I learned very quickly that money does not bring happiness. And I knew it not just from myself and my own experiences, but also from seeing so many other young people who had also kind of fallen into a bunch of money by playing poker professionally. And I saw how very obviously it didn't make them happy. So that connection was severed from me very, very quickly. That most people take a much longer time to learn that lesson. So after I left poker, I had to figure out, like, what do I want to do with my life? I'm 21, I have, no real skills. I basically am just like a college dropout. What am I going to do with my life? And for a long time I didn't really know, and then I came across Effective Altruism. And there we go. No, Effective Altruism. One more. So Effective Altruism, I read all these arguments, and they really made sense to me, and it sort of seemed like, yes, this gets at the kernel of what I care about. Because I want to have impact in the world, but I don't really know how to. I don't really know what it means to have impact. Just sort of blindly pursuing, accruing money doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't really matter to me. It doesn't motivate me. But if you really just think, 1 second farther than yourself, that money actually has a massive impact in other parts of the world. There's massive impact if you actually direct it toward the places where it can do the most good. And so I realized, like, hey, I think I'm a pretty competitive person. I'm pretty good at, getting good at things. So maybe I should go into the tech industry and try to learn how to code and enter into what is potentially one of the frothiest employment markets in recent history. So that's what I did. I came out here, moved to Silicon Valley. I remember at the time I was living in, this is back when App Academy was right on Market Street. And I was living in this really shitty dorm that was it was like 1/3 of this thing right here, with another App Academy student in a bunk bed right above me, and a shared bathroom in the hallway. And I just, all I did was I ate, breathed, and lived App Academy for 3 months. And eventually I ended up getting hired by App Academy as a TA, and that's when I first started earning to give. That's when I first started donating the money that I was making to charity. So the very first job at App Academy, I donated 33% of my income, my pre-tax income, every year since then. And that's sort of the goal that I hold myself to. And my goal is that as I ideally make more money, that I can donate even more than that. So that's kind of my story. Some of you guys probably heard of the story of me going to Airbnb and job offers and blah, blah, blah. And then now I'm working in the crypto industry, so I do a lot of weird shit. But this is really what got me in the game, is that I believe that what I do matters because of where I direct the resources that I've gained in my career towards. So where do I donate? I mostly donate to 3 general areas. The first is to anti-malarial interventions. So there's a foundation here called the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes anti-malarial bed nets. The second cause area I do is charity advocacy. This is essentially kind of along the lines of what I'm telling you guys, of just getting people to think more rigorously about how they donate money. Because I suspect that sort of has this kind of ringing effect, that the more people who understand and start thinking more deeply about where to donate, they get the people around them start thinking more deeply on how to donate, and more than just what I can do myself, many, many more people can kind of start advocating the same message, and the thing sort of grows. And the last thing that I donate to is existential risk research. So I think this tends to be one of the areas that's most underfunded for how important it is. And so that's one place where I've been also donating some of my income. So what's in it for you? Why should you bother doing this? And I have some things here that I guess you can read. But I guess for me, I'm a pretty cynical person, right? When people tell me a story about how something is so great, I tend to call bullshit. I tend to not believe them. And that's very much true about me internally as well, right? I tend to be very self-critical. I tend to be very doubtful of my own intentions, my own designs, my own sort of life story. Like, how much am I bullshitting myself about what I'm doing? I don't know. But the one thing that effective altruism kind of serves as, for me, it's the one thing in my life that I know I'm not bullshitting myself about. Like, it's sort of the one thing that I know I'm really having an impact. No matter how much my job feels like bullshit, no matter how much my persona or social media or what's going on in Silicon Valley or what we're building out here, no matter how much of it I can get down and cynical about, the one thing that I know is that I'm having a real impact. And that for me has been a very powerful lodestone in pushing forward in my own career. So, whoops, okay. Everybody pull out your phone. Pull out your phone. Okay, so I want you to navigate to this website, effectivealtruism.org. So this is the best primer, basically, to kind of get you plugged into what is the basic thing that effective altruism is all about. This is the right starting place if you want to learn more. And if you don't want to go here, you can just click around on your phone and text people, it's fine. But if you are curious, and if this is something that you are interested in, this is the place to go. So I would encourage you later on when you're in the bathroom or whatever to click around and read through as much as you can. And obviously the folks here at App Academy are totally willing to talk to you about effective altruism. So you can talk to John. There's also a group. Is there a group?
Currently no, but
There's currently no group, but there will be because you're going to start it. And you can also reach out to me or to anybody else who is involved in this wonderful production. There's also a big and very active effective altruist community here in the Bay Area. So there are a lot of folks who are really smart and engaged and excited and would love to talk to you if this is something that you're interested in. And with that, we can go to questions. That's it for me. Okay, yes?
See, I can talk. How does, the question is, how does this framework of thinking about where to donate factor into things like impacts from unknown unknowns, meaning like basic research and science? Like, would you advocate not donating more money into that field because you don't know what kind of impact that would give in the end?
That's a great question. To my mind, the answer is that the world is full of unknown unknowns, right? And even the things that are sort of the known unknowns, we're just kind of taking our best guess at what we think the world is like, right? Ultimately, you can't opt out of that guessing. You have to sort of take a shot and say, hey, how much do I think basic research matters? And you have to sort of take a guess also of, okay, given the amount of funding that's currently available for basic research, how much will a marginal increase in the funding toward basic research impact the rate of new discoveries? I think at the end of the day, you have to make a guess about what you think the world is like, and given your model of the world, what do you think will be most effective? While you'll never be right, and you'll probably always be surprised, I don't think there's a way out of that cycle, if that makes sense.
Follow up, then, would effective altruism give you a framework for making that guess, or is it up to you to make that guess?
I don't think effective altruism gives you a framework to make that guess.
Okay.
I think effective altruism gives you a framework on how to think about making the right choice given a framework or given a model of the world. But it tells you nothing about how to build a model of the world, right? So if you don't know what's going to happen if you increase funding to basic research, too bad, you got to guess. Yeah. Yes?
So ultimately, the decision to give and to be altruistic, it has to come from within. So kind of building off the last question, I totally understand you want to utilize have the biggest impact for your dollar. How do you balance like a person who's affected by Huntington's disease rather than cancer? Like if it's just your own personal thing or something that you can have a better impact with?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
What's
The reality is that charity is not just about impact, right? We all understand that intuitively. There's more to what we do when we try to do good things in our community and to our family and to our loved ones than just maximizing impact, right? to my mind, the right and most just way to deal with this. So I'm somebody who I also care about a lot of causes that I don't believe are maximizing my impact in the world and reducing suffering the most. That's okay. To my mind, the way that you want to deal with that is by, in a way, realizing that those are two separate things, right? Being engaged in your community and helping out people face to face, and feeling the sort of, to be somewhat derisive to call it sort of the warm fuzzy feeling that you get when you're actually, connecting with other human beings and helping them directly. Sending money to Africa for bed nets, like it's kind of cold and distant, and you don't really, you don't see the smile on someone's face. And it's important not to trivialize that, right? However, I also think they're just not the same thing, right? There's donating money to try to actually reduce suffering in the world. And there's donating money because that's just part of what it means to be a good person, right? And that should come out of, in some sense, a separate budget. It should be a separate thing that you do, and you understand that, look, when I go to my local nonprofit and volunteer there, I'm not trying to maximize my impact. I'm trying to be more involved in my community. And that's just a separate thing I'm trying to do, right? So, I volunteer a lot at Railsbridge, which is, this nonprofit that helps teach women and people of color how to code. And it's not the most effective way that I could use my time or money, right? But I know that, and that's okay. I go there because I like to go there. I like who it makes me as a person to go there, right? But if I have a friend in need, or if I know somebody, or there's some charity that I feel particularly tugged by, I'm happy to donate there. But I know that that comes out of there's my budget where I maximize impact, and the budget where I do the things that I think make me a better and more connected human being. And I think if you separate those two things, you'll end up having a lot more equanimity in your approach toward giving.
Can I have one follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you make that balance in your own life? What's your deciding factor, your rationale?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a very legible criterion, but basically, that 33% is my effective altruism, maximizing impact. I'm not trying to feel good in the allocation of that 33%. But there are other ways in which I do. So ultimately giving to charity is ultimately a social and a communal thing. And there are times when I've given charities that somebody asked me hey, there's this charity, I'm really passionate about it, would you give some money? And I'm saying, sure, why not? I want to support you. I think that's a great cause. But it just comes out of a different part of my brain. So right now I don't have a framework for it because it doesn't come up that often that I need a framework. But if it's something that you're actively involved in, I would encourage you to think about how to build a framework like that for yourself. Yeah. Yes?
Considering that, from my own perspective, I see kind of present-day Western concepts of impact to be extremely short-sighted. Is there a branch of the effective altruism community that kind of deals with the issues of sustainability, and kind of related to that, especially if you're talking about donations, the issue of, well, what is the impact of the source of your income versus where you're donating the money?
Yeah. No, those are both great questions. So in terms of sustainability, so I don't know what exactly you mean by sustainability, because that's a very broad concept. But there are a lot of folks in the effective altruism community. Ultimately, effective altruism is just kind of an orientation, right? It's not a particular set of beliefs or injunctions, right? It's sort of just thinking rigorously about where to do good, right? That's the big blanket concept. Within that, there are a lot of different folks who have very different beliefs about what is the best way to practice effective altruism. And so there are some people who think that sustainability, ecological welfare are one of the most important cause areas to focus on, and they find ways to maximize impact there. And there are also folks who, there was a very famous New York Times article back in, I want to say 2011 or 2012, back when effective altruism just started blossoming, and there are these famous examples of these guys who basically went to Wall Street to earn money as traders and whatever, but then donate a bunch of their income, and they were living in closets or something just so they could donate even more money, right? And so there was this guy, I can't remember, David something, who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, basically saying well, but look what they're doing, left hand is doing with the right hand, how can you be doing evil and doing good at the same time? Come on. And I think it's a very good question. The reality is that here's my take, and this is not an authoritative take, is that when we think about doing good versus doing harm, right? A lot of times we think about who is the person who has blood on their hands, right? We think, who is the person who actually held the knife when it went down? And we are much more loath to ask the question of, okay, if you weren't there holding the knife, would the knife have gone in anyway, right? as human beings, we tend to think of morality in terms of sort of group dynamics. And group dynamics are a lot of times about blame. They're a lot of times about who gets rewarded and who gets punished when something bad happens, right? But if you really just care about how much suffering happens in the world, then you just care more about how the bad thing doesn't happen at all. I don't care if it's on my hands, I don't care if it's on someone else's hands, I care that the bad thing just stops, right? And in that framework, you want to think more about replaceability, in the sense that if I didn't go do this thing, would someone have done it anyway, right? And the answer a lot of times is yes, right? So one example is like becoming a doctor. Becoming a doctor is one of those things that's like canonically good person thing, right? If you're a really good person, you go become a doctor. Now in reality, if you've met a lot of doctors, you know it's kind of bullshit. Doctors tend to be, you know, whatever. We still kind of have this in our collective, you know, Jungian unconscious about doctors, that they tend to be good, open-hearted people. But the reality is that, you know, if you are like, I want to do the most good in the world, I want to save lives, so I'm going to go become a doctor. Well, the reality is that there are a lot of people trying to be doctors. And if you didn't become that doctor, someone else would be in the operating rooms that you would have been in, and they would have been doing the exact same shit you would have been, right? There's not a shortage of doctors that you need to go fill, and you don't cause more good in the world by becoming the person who is the doctor, right? Maybe if you're better than that doctor, then great. But do you know you're better than that doctor? I mean, I don't know. You haven't even gone to med school yet. So I think, now a lot of people are resistant to that framework. They think that's the wrong way to think about it. They think the right way to think about it is, are you personally morally responsible for you are personally morally responsible for the things that you do. And even if other people do bad things, tough shit, I mean, let's try to stop them, but you should be doing the right thing directly with your own life. And that's just a ethical, philosophical question that, you know, I can't resolve for you. You have to decide for yourself. So that's my answer. I don't know if that was satisfying. Cool. We'll take one more. Yeah.
I don't know, the cynical part of you might say this isn't possible, but what would you say is the best way to infuse this philosophy into our governmental policy making?
Best way to infuse it into governmental policy making. I mean, I think the answer in my mind is probably very boring, which is that first, you are not going to be able to infuse this into government policy making today, because I mean, ultimately people are guided by their incentives, and their incentives are that, you know, people just basically respond to their base or whoever elected them into power or whoever is controlling the purse strings of their future elections. So I'm not terrifically hopeful that the way that policy happens changes. What I'm more hopeful is that the populace changes, right? And that the best way to actually enact change in a representative government is not to like try to grab the representatives and shake them until they agree with you. The best way is just to make people change their minds about things. Right? I mean, ultimately, that's how most of the social changes happened in the last decade. Has largely been not because you know, senators suddenly had a come to Jesus moment. It's that attitudes in the country changed, right? And especially from young people and activists, kind of galvanizing these changes in the population. So, you know, one example of this is that people are very scared of China, especially because China just has such a different regime. You know, it's authoritative, it's centralized. But the reality is, if you look at young people in China, if you've like actually met young people in China, they're basically fucking Americans. You know, they're so westernized relative to their parents. And it's kind of just a matter of time when, you know, enough of the old guard who are kind of, you know, leading the current party die and get replaced by their younger representatives, that China is inevitably going to westernize. And anybody who knows that, like who's sort of been there on the ground, sees that happening, right? The same way I think that is largely what I hope to happen in, you know, other countries around the world, is that as people just start thinking more deeply and just getting, you know, being more thoughtful about these memes, that it'll just happen organically. Just as the people who actually make object level decisions in their lives change their perspectives. That's my take. I could be wrong, but that's roughly what I believe. Cool. Let's get you out of here. You guys need to actually learn how to code so you can make money.